Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Here's what's coming up tonight on the program. Concern this evening following a decision by the High Court to overturn a 20-year precedent in relation to the detention of illegal migrants. Now, this could lead to the release of dozens of stateless detainees, including one whose visa was cancelled because of child sex offences. Legal expert Chris Merritt coming up with more. And speaking of the courts, the first Australian climate change test case has been brought on behalf of Indigenous Australians against the federal government. And this might be the first of its kind, but I fear taxpayers will be the big losers here. Plus, new research reveals the depth of bias from so-called fact-checking organisations during the Voice campaign. We even have one organisation that never bothered checking, not even once, a Yes campaign claim, only targeting those on the no side like me. And one day on, consumers are rightly demanding answers from Optus as the telco remains evasive about what caused yesterday's massive outage. This is a lesson in what not to do in a crisis.
The network is restored. We will have a look at ways in which we can thank our customers for their patience and reward them for their loyalty.
It would seem very reasonable for Optus to look at how they can attempt to recompense people for this.
But first, more on the Islamic terror preachers in Australia. While the Prime Minister's been dancing and wearing flowers in his hair, spruiking Australia's climate credentials in the Cook Islands, in the latest bid for Labor to host its new vanity project, COP31, the Climate Jamboree, at home his government is failing to show leadership where it's needed. The war in Gaza may not quite have produced civil unrest in Australia, but here and elsewhere, it's produced an absolutely unprecedented outpouring of race hate against Jewish people. On October 7, Hamas terrorists, deliberately and in cold blood, slaughtered nearly 1,500 Israelis, killing children in front of their parents, and then whole families in scenes of indescribable horror. Yet to tens of thousands of people protesting and marching here, it's as if they're all saying it's Israel's fault and that the Jews were somehow asking for it. Now, almost as bad, you've got signs like this around Melbourne University, where across a poster of an Israeli taken as a Hamas hostage is the lie that what happened a month ago is somehow a fiction, or as this sticker reads, Zionist propaganda. Now, it's fair enough to demand that the Israeli government do its best to minimise civilian casualties, among those that Hamas is now using as human shields, and to seek a humanitarian pause in military operations to allow food and water into Gaza. But in no reasonable moral universe is there any equivalence whatsoever between the Hamas death cult and the Israeli armed forces now trying to deal with it. Yet here in Australia, it seems, and I stand to be corrected if they have, but I can't find a single Muslim authority that has condemned the butchery by Hamas. Indeed, Muslim preacher after preacher has celebrated it, and tens of thousands of Australians, many recent migrants, but others just ignorant, muddled and nasty, have marched in support of it. Here's one.
I'm smiling and I'm happy. I'm elated. It's a day of courage. It's a day of happiness. It's a day of pride. It's a day of victory. This is the day we've been waiting for.
Here is another.
The jihad is the solution for the ummah. There is no other way. Jihad is part of our deen and one of the highest pillars of our deen. Hamas is mujahideen and freedom fighters and warriors.
Seriously, Hamas, a listed terror organisation, and he calls them warriors. Here's another.
To the invading Jews we say, by Allah, the day you will be kicked out of Palestine is coming. A day when the stones and the trees will speak and say, "O Muslim, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him."
Indeed, this hate preacher, formerly known as Wasim Hadid, has a history of inciting hatred going back 2 decades. And then, to our great shame, here are the crowds. But lest anyone think that these are just unrepresentative extremists, the Grand Mufti of Australia, the Islamic equivalent of the Anglican Primate or President of the Catholic Bishops' Conference, so Australia's foremost Muslim leader, in a post just 3 days after the Hamas atrocity, blamed Israel for what had happened. The central issue at stake, he said, and this is Dr. Ibrahim Abu Muhammad, in this bloody iteration of violence, is not about Hamas, but rather about the innocent Palestinian people who have been oppressed for more than 70 years. He went on to talk of, and I quote, the brilliance of that every measure of resistance takes on with their boldness and their innovations, saying, and I quote, the blood of martyrs will smell of musk because his will never breaks and his resolve never fails. Now, to be clear, this is Australia's leading Muslim cleric praising the Hamas terrorists. It's little wonder that 102 Australian Holocaust survivors today issued a statement that's worth citing at some length. They said, never did we think that we would witness a reenactment of the senseless and virulent hatred of Jews that we faced in Europe. The actions of Hamas, they said, are so familiar, so barbaric. Yet instead of condemning this, the response across the globe is a shameful spike in anti-Semitism. Our memories and our experiences in ghettos, concentration camps, and in hiding, seeing our families and our communities vanish, compel us to raise our voices and implore humanity to reject hatred, bigotry and violence, to recognise the agenda of Hamas, condemn it accordingly, and call for the immediate release of all hostages, men, women, babies and the elderly. We cannot allow history, they said, to repeat itself. Now, to his credit, the Prime Minister initially condemned Hamas and their barbarity, and he asserted Israel's right to defend itself. But it took him almost 2 weeks to speak with the Israeli PM, and while he's constantly overseas, he's yet to make a solidarity visit to Israel, as most Western leaders have. The Education Minister, Jason Clare, well, he has condemned the hate preachers, saying there's no place for hate here in Australia. But from the other Labor cabinet ministers, also representing Western Sydney, where these hate preachers are largely based, Tony Burke and Chris Bowen, well, they have said very, very little. Now, it's just not good enough for the federal government to take next to no action against these violence-praising, hate-inciting preachers on the spurious grounds that next to non-existent Islamophobia is as real a danger as this rampant anti-Semitism, or citing a concern for free speech entirely at odds with Labor's normal preoccupation with misinformation. The mosques hosting these preachers must lose any grants from taxpayers that they're getting, and now. If the hate preachers are Australian citizens, Australians of convenience, not conviction, they must be prosecuted under the abundance of laws already in place against race hate and discrimination now. Prosecuted now. And if the hate preachers are on visas, they must be deported on character grounds now. Likewise, all those chanting "gas the Jews." If they're Australians, charge them. If they're not, deport them. Likewise, these now routine protests calling for the destruction of Israel. Don't let them march. Don't let them chant their hate-filled slogans. If the police could break up freedom marches during the pandemic, they should be more than capable of breaking up "Kill the Jews" marches now. There should be no place for Jew hatred here in Australia, and the federal government cannot sit on the fence. The PM needs to get home now, sort this out now. All right, let's get the headlines now. Sky News political reporter Trudy McIntosh.
Good evening. Optus is refusing to reveal what triggered the nationwide blackout which caused chaos for millions of customers.
If you can't call 000 and there's an emergency, people can die. It's serious.
People who rely on telephones, computers, businesses, individuals, shocking.
The national outage triggered calls for financial compensation.
Now that the network is restored, we will have a look at ways in which we can thank our customers for their patience.
People's phones weren't working, so they couldn't pay FPOS. Sales yesterday were much lower than expected.
So the Optus crisis management.
And missing in action, to be honest. As I've said, a total clown show.
The Communications Minister has launched a post-incident review into the outage. Regulator ACMA will look into the 000 call disaster. The Senate has also launched an inquiry that will force the media-shy CEO to answer questions. The Prime Minister opening the chequebook as he met Pacific leaders in the Cook Islands. New funding will go towards climate mitigation measures in the region, including building infrastructure to protect against natural disasters and rising sea levels.
Australia has an important role to play here. We're providing some $350 million in our Pacific Climate Infrastructure Financing Partnership.
And no trip to the Pacific would be complete for an Australian leader without a dance with the locals. And Labor has lost control of its industrial relations changes in the Senate. Independents David Pocock and Jackie Lambie secured enough support to pass 4 parts of Labor's package. That includes help for first responders with PTSD claim compensation and protecting victims of domestic violence from discrimination.
If that isn't passed by the lower house this year, then they will be denying those people the right.
It was a stupid way they did it in the first place. Surely they couldn't get dumb and dumber, surely.
For now, Workplace Relations Minister Tony Burke is not backing down. Labor privately fears it will never get support for other key elements like labour hire laws if the bill is formally split.
And unfortunately, it looks like the government is being pig-headed about this.
But you can't say that those 4 things are enough.
Also in the Senate this afternoon, the Greens staged yet another protest, holding up signs and calling for a ceasefire in Gaza.
Cease fire now!
Oh, that's that's out of order.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
Well, let's go to the biggest story of the week. That outage yesterday from Optus, 10 million customers stranded, 400,000 businesses without a phone service or access to the internet. Joining me now, the first panel of the night. Radio 2GB host Michael McLaren and Herald Sun senior writer, columnist too, Patrick Carline. Gents, welcome. Michael, we saw just late-breaking news before I went to air at 6 that there will be some data compensation given to some customers. We don't know that it's across the board yet, certainly starting with business customers. But they've literally lost millions and millions of dollars. We've got schools and hospitals impacted as well. I think it's been a horror show. I think someone there today has called it a clown show from the Optus CEO. But surely they deserve proper compensation for lost incomes yesterday. But also, we've got to have a federal investigation. We can't have this happen again. And I'm surprised she didn't resign today.
Well, I am too, Peter. Look, I mean, if it is a clown show, and it seems to be that way, the ringmaster of the circus has got to take the fall, and that's Ms. Rosmarin. This isn't her first rodeo either in this respect, and there seems to be a bit of a theme developing under her leadership at Optus, and that is when things go wrong, you don't really disclose much. I mean, they are in the telecommunications business. The majority of that word is communications, and they seem almost incapable of communicating with their customers. I mean, people deserve better. $100, sort of free data or whatever they're going to throw around. I mean, that's all nice, but that doesn't really pay the bills that weren't paid yesterday by lost income. That doesn't really help the people that had all sorts of medical emergencies and everything else and couldn't get through the telecommunication breakdown. People deserve to know, shareholders particularly, who own the company, let's not forget, deserve to know what went wrong. I mean, you can't just keep putting these things in the third drawer. I don't think they would, if I'm mistaken, I don't think they disclosed what went wrong last time, really, when they had the internal investigation.
No, they haven't.
And they're not going to do it this time.
Now, and unless the company feels some pain, let me tell you, they will not go through what they need to do internally to fix it so it doesn't happen again. Let's go to the Melbourne Council. Mary Beck, you might know it if you're Victorian as Moreland Council, changed its name. It made a decision last night. It endorsed a motion to fly the Palestinian flag for 6 months, they say, and I'll use their words, in recognition of genocide being carried out against Palestinians in Gaza. One of the councillors, Oscar Yildiz, he didn't support the motion, and he has since now received death threats against himself and his family. Have a listen.
Last night's motion, it's caused, threats. I'm talking about really serious threats now, and just stuff about my family. I hope the plane that you're on crashes. And they're saying, inshallah. So they're saying, God willing, you will die in a plane.
The point he's making, Patrick, he said it's just virtue signalling. He said we're a local government. We've got all the local government things in the Constitution to do and to fix. We have nothing to do with foreign policy. He didn't support it on those grounds, but now he's copying this.
Well, it's dreadfully unfair, Peter. I mean, I know Oscar. He's a good man. He's an honourable man, and he's getting death threats. This is grandstanding of the highest order. Who's going to listen to a local council from the other side of the world talk about boycotting Israel and this sort of hateful rhetoric? And it is moving the goalposts, as you were saying earlier. All this sort of anti-Semitic type sort of rhetoric at the moment is going unchecked, and people like poor old Oscar are suffering for it in these really dreadful ways. I haven't seen this before in Australia. It really is an uncertain time, and the next few weeks we really do need to tackle this sort of grandstanding, because it really is dangerous.
Yeah, there's a lack of leadership in Michael McLaren, though, from the Prime Minister. Honestly, yes, he made some comments in the early aftermath of the atrocities now about a month ago, but we've got businesses today. There's been a boycott campaign against Spotlight and Chemist Warehouse. Both are owned or connected to Jewish families. People are saying, don't go and support those stores. We've got 102 Holocaust survivors out there saying we didn't think we would live to ever see this level of anti-Semitism again. We had the EU Commissioner out 2 days ago saying this has got the portent of the 1930s. I mean, this is horrific. This is happening in Australia, and we've got a Prime Minister who's basically checked out because so many seats in Western Sydney and parts of Melbourne held by Labor are branch stacked to their eyeballs with Arab community members.
Well, the Prime Minister would be no doubt getting some pressure from some of those rather senior figures in his government who represent those seats. But it's not just he that's not showing enough leadership here. I mean, it goes right to the top, to the United Nations, doesn't it, Peter? I mean, you've got this conga line of criticism, not just recently, although it's been ratcheted up recently, but for years now, the Security Council particularly has had motion after motion before it criticising Israel. Some of those motions maybe had some merit. The majority were just nonsense. The rest of the world combined, as far as the criticism is concerned, tallied less than the critics against Israel in the Security Council. I mean, that tells you all you need to know about the base politics of the United Nations and where that international pinnacle body is. So, I mean, when you go all the way to the top politically, the Jewish state is just being belted here by people that I think largely don't even know what they're talking about. I mean, all this divestment, I mean, this is really the latest BDS movement thing. I mean, the people that are signing up to this, I'm sure most of them have no idea about the recent history of the Middle East, let alone the millennia of history, which is informative of where we are today in the Middle East. They've got no idea. They've just jumped on the bandwagon, as others have said already. I mean, this is now really getting to a tipping point, because if we just allow this to happen and we just say, oh, well, it's just a bit of an economic boycott, what next? I mean, what next? And if leaders aren't going to just draw that line in the sand, we are in trouble.
I might also add too, the AFP have referred, the preacher I brought to you last night, Abu al-Sayed, Wissam Hadid is his other name. They have referred him to a counter-terrorism squad for assessment. We'll see what happens there. We'll report that back when it does. Let's go to Queensland, Patrick. The unions are tolling the bell, we're told today, for Anastasia Palaszczuk.
Well, that's right. I mean, she's the last standing of the pandemic premiers, isn't she? I mean, Dan's gone in Victoria, Gladys in New South Wales, Mark McGowan out west, and she's sort of sticking out the room at this point. The people don't want her. Her own party doesn't want her. The unions that got her into power don't want her. And it seems as though she really wants to stay. So as a spectator, this is going to be fascinating to watch, to see how the party actually goes about trying to minimise the damage of trying to overthrow somebody who really doesn't want to leave the room. It's fascinating.
And Michael, you're a dad. What do you think of this idea in Queensland? They are trialling, if you can believe it, a 4-day school week. So kids will be home for parents to look after, or childcare centres for 3 days a week. I mean, parents work for 5 usually, but the kids will go to school. We're talking about primary school children here, secondary school children, 4 days a week only. Now, we're going down in the world rankings, not up in the world rankings. Don't our kids need more time at school, not less time at school?
Well, it depends who you ask, Peter. Some might say less time at school might do them the world of good, but I mean, that's maybe a cynical answer. But look, how this would work in practice, we're told, a brief reading of all of this, we're told effectively nothing's going to change, and yet everything's going to change. Some schools might choose earlier or later starting times, some might want to cram 5 days of curricula into 4, but there'll still be staff there on the Wednesday or the Friday or whatever the day is not the teaching day, because as we know, everyone else is at work and they've got to put their kids somewhere. That's what the school is, an educational facility, but it also is a very handy daycare for 6 or 8 hours a day. So what is actually driving this, I don't know, because as I said, it looks as though they're still going to effectively have the gates open 5 days a week. So why this trial and what exactly we're trialling, I'm buggered if I know.
Well, if you don't know, we don't know, and any of us don't know. Michael McLaren, thank you. Patrick Carline, as always, great to have you company. All right, just before we go to the OECD has reported today, Australian households have suffered the largest fall in living standards of any advanced economy. Well, we all know that, don't we? The cause, they say, high inflation, high interest rates and rising income taxes are hurting our budgets. Right, after the break, we'll get into that issue today out of the High Court, a decision that poses serious challenges for our immigration detention program. And a massive study looking at the voice and fact-checking. You'll be astonished at the results. Welcome back. In a moment, I'm going to take you through the results of a study on just how biased those fact-checking organisations were against the no side during the Voice campaign. But first to the High Court, where a precedent, a 20-year-old precedent, has just been overturned. And the precedent means that there's a real cloud about the use of detention for foreign-born individuals who enter Australia without a visa, or anyone here who's had a visa cancelled in circumstances where it's impossible to deport them. The Home Affairs Department believes the result could trigger the immediate release of some 92 people who cannot be returned to their country of origin. Now, one of these people includes the plaintiff in this case, known by the pseudonym NZYQ, a stateless Rohingya man, so that's in and around Burma, who faced the prospect of detention for life because no country had agreed to resettle him due to a criminal conviction for sexual intercourse with a 10-year-old child. Now, this is shocking. Joining me now to discuss it, the Australian's legal contributor, Chris Merritt. Chris, take us through this High Court ruling. I mean, does this mean that this child rapist, we don't know their name, could be released in Australia?
That's what it looks like. This is a nightmare for the federal government. The High Court seems to be going out of its way to create nightmares for Prime Minister Albanese. He's already got to work out how he's going to respond to the court's decision on stripping citizenship from dual nationals. Now he's got to work out not just what he's going to do with this particular person, but he's faced with a potential bill for compensation that could run to millions of dollars. And quite frankly, I feel terribly sorry for the government. And its predecessor, the Morrison government, they've acted in the reasonable expectation that the High Court had set the ground rules when it comes to detention of these people. And now the court has turned around and changed the ground rules in a way that counsel for the government has told the court that will inevitably lead to claims for compensation that the government will be unable to defend. It will simply have to pay up. So that's point number one. But what do we do with people like this child rapist who may now be released into the community, and he won't be the last. This decision applies to those people who are in detention and cannot be deported to other countries because nobody else will take them. The court heard that this really applies to the most undesirable characters you can imagine, because the more undesirable they are, the least likely it is that any other country will take them. So it's an enormous quandary for the government.
I guess you and I understand the legal ins and outs here, but if you're sitting at home watching this, you're saying, well, hang on, you came here either illegally, you came via a boat or some other means, or you came here and your visa was cancelled, in many cases, obviously, on character grounds, and a child rapist doesn't deserve to stay in Australia on character grounds. Well, why on earth do we then have to keep these people, not only keep them in Australia, but we have to let them out of detention? Why?
Look, it's a reasonable view, and honestly, I sympathise with that view. I think the problem is at the border. Once these people are in Australia, they clearly gain the benefit of all the legal rights and avenues of appeal that are available to people who are born here or who arrive legally. I think the answer is to stop them at the border. Don't let these people in. Check them more assiduously, and I think that's the challenge now confronting the government.
But Chris, surely given legislation can trump a High Court decision, can't the Parliament, it's got to do something about Ben Breaker, the convicted terrorist who's just had his Australian citizenship reinstated. They said they would, they haven't. Surely they can perhaps legislate their way around this new decision.
I think they'll be looking at that, but it's a bit difficult right now to say what they could do, because the reasons for this decision have not been released. All we've got is the outcome. We don't know what the reasons are. We don't know whether it's a unanimous decision. We don't know whether it's a split decision. We don't know what the possibilities are for a government response. All we know is that it's unlawful to keep this child rapist in indefinite detention, and others.
And of course, you know, the Prime Minister, I keep saying, he's away, he's constantly away. This is why he needs to get behind his desk, because it's not just this, it's all the other economic issues as well. But I mean, this is the stuff he's got to turn his mind to. And we hear today too, Chris, Torres Strait Islander activists are also going to the courts. They're going to the federal court in this case, taking the Australian government, meaning the taxpayer, to court to say that they have not been protected as traditional owners because they're on the front line of catastrophic climate change. Now, what happens here if their bid gets up?
Look, with the greatest of respect to the people who brought this case, it looks to me like a bit of a try-on. You might remember last year, 2 years ago, there was a very similar case where I think it was 3 school children tried to, or they won at first instance. They argued.
Yeah, Justice Bromberg, I think, wasn't it? Justice Bromberg?
That's right. That's exactly right. Justice Bromberg ruled in their favour and said that the federal government owed them a duty to not approve a mine because this could cause them death and injury. That was overturned, thankfully, by the full federal court, and I suspect this case will go exactly the same way. It's a bit of a try-on to argue that the federal government, which is what they're arguing that the federal government should, by itself, reduce carbon discharges so that their island homes won't disappear under the sea. Now, Australia, on last count, I think it was just over 1% of global carbon emissions come from Australia.
You're right.
So whatever we did would have no influence at all. It would have no impact at all. It's also notable that one of the plaintiffs in this case did attend a litigation workshop with some others. So it needs to be kept in mind.
All right. About a month, do you think, before we get the reasons for the judgment in relation to permanent or indefinite detention?
That sounds about right, if we're lucky.
If we're lucky. All right. Thanks, Chris Merritt. Thanks for that update. Incredibly important. I can tell you right now, people smugglers to our north will be marketing that decision. They are quick at it, and you'll see an increase in traffic, I suspect. All right, let's go to the issue of the voice, because you'll remember during the run-up, we had all these fact checkers after they're after me as well as others, particularly because I went out there, remember, and I said that the Uluru Statement from the Heart is not the one page of the PM tells you it is. It's 26 pages and it means voice, treaty and truth. Well, a new report today from the Institute of Public Affairs has concluded that the three main fact-checking organisations, AAP Fact Check, RMIT Fact Lab and the RMIT's ABC Fact Check, were all strongly biased against opponents of the voice, disproportionately scrutinising those on the no case. The report found that 91% of these so-called fact checks targeted the no side, while the Yes campaign got away with lying, twisting the truth and omitting key tenets of their radical agenda to reshape our democracy. Joining me to discuss this, the author of the report, the Director of Legal Rights at the Institute of Public Affairs, John Story. Well, I hate to say we thought this would be the case, but I didn't even think that I'd see statistics like that come out, John. What can you tell us? Take us through the report.
Yeah, so from when Anthony Albanese won the election in May last year until referendum date, there are 187 fact check articles by the three organisations. 91%, or 170 of them, were targeting opponents of the voice or the no case. Only 17 looked at the yes case. One of the three fact checkers, RMIT Fact Lab, 100%, they never saw fit to look at a single argument of the yes case. 100%. Not one. Not a single one. As well as that, most of their findings were of false. So they would say, oh, we deem this viewpoint to be false. Of the 170 targeting the no case, one of them was found to be true. But of the mere 17 targeting the yes case, 7 were found to be true. So nearly half. So a lot more generous in that area. An interesting fact is that after your reporting exposing the fact checkers in August this year, lifting the lid on some of their financial arrangements and some of the other mischief that was going on, miraculously, that's when some of their articles about the yes case came out. So AAP, for example, they only targeted the yes case 8 times. In over a year, there was only 2, but after your reporting, in a span of a few weeks, 6 came out against the yes case. That shows that it has nothing to do with newsworthiness, it has nothing to do with proving facts. They're pushing an ideological agenda, and it was extremely biased.
Credit where credit due. That was Jack Horton, I think, who really lifted the lid on the fact checkers. But, Sky News has pursued this because they are now used constantly as a way to attack the centre-right side of politics, views that they find don't mesh with the progressive left. And I think it'll get worse, obviously, on that misinformation legislation. We'll get to that in a moment. But what's interesting here, when they say they're fact-checking, you think that they are checking fact, but they're not, are they?
No, they're as often as not checking opinions. They're even checking satire. So in the case of opinions, we got from AAP Fact Check in writing, in correspondence with the IPA, that they think it's a legitimate form of fact checking to get an opinion from an expert with a different opinion to what they're fact checking. Yeah,
so this is the point. Well, let's use the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I say it's 26 pages based on an FOI that comes from a legal department that says it's 26 pages, and then 6 years almost of comments from the author saying it's many, many pages long.
Yep.
They then go and find nothing to dispute that, other than someone saying she's got it wrong. It's 1 page, not 26 pages. That's opinion versus opinion. It's not opinion versus fact.
Yeah, in their wording, as long as it's an expert, and sometimes these experts were not even practicing lawyers, making expert opinions on legal matters. They were as often as not academics. That is their standard for fact checking, if they can find an expert with a contrary opinion. And as you know, I mean, every contentious issue, from climate change to gender theory to immigration or whatever, will have experts on each side with different opinions. So as long as they can cherry pick the expert opinion that fits their narrative, they put that up as false, as in the whatever viewpoint, in your case that the Uluru Statement from the Heart is 26 pages, fact check false. That ties in with the social media companies that then allows them to censor that.
And they just drop it from the algorithm so people don't see it in their newsfeed. Just quickly, they all belong to this international network. This is what gives them sort of official cover. Given what you found, there's a likelihood, isn't there, that these players in Australia have breached the rules of their international association. Surely now they must be discredited or removed in some way.
So being a signature to the International Fact-Checking Network requires them to sign up to a code of principles, one of which is to be unbiased and balanced, including not unduly targeting one side. I mean, you couldn't get more extreme targeting of one side on the voice debate. What are the consequences? Well, RMIT ABC fact check, they were taken off the panel of Facebook because their accreditation had lapsed. They've just been reappointed. So all of these findings of bias, they weren't quite as bad. They were 77% targeting one side. Today, the International Fact-Checking Network said, no, they're doing a wonderful job, and they've been reappointed. So it's really just it's really a scam. It's just a way to the social media organisations to outsource their fact-checking to fellow travellers with the same opinions, but with the facade of independence.
Isn't it funny they can stop this sort of speech, but they're quite happy with anti-Semitic hate speech? John Story, thank you. All right, after the break, more evidence the ABC is not providing a balanced view on the conflict in Gaza. Plus, it's been revealed that mining companies pay more tax than every other sector of the economy combined. Yet this is a government that wants to shut mining down. Coming up, a new report that unpacks the left-wing politicisation of the public service across Australia. But first, to the ABC, which hosted a mass meeting yesterday about the national broadcaster's coverage of the Hamas terror attacks and the war in Gaza. Staff complained that the ABC's coverage of Israel's ground invasion of Gaza was too heavily reliant on talking points, they said, from the Israel Defence Force. They also raised concerns about the ABC's unwillingness to use language such as invasion, occupation, genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing and more regarding the Israeli government policy. Mark Maley, the ABC's editorial policy manager, even said the allegation of war crimes against Israel at the moment is obviously a credible allegation. Obviously. Joining me now, my panel, Shadow Minister for Fisheries, Forestry and the Environment, Tassie Senator John O'Donoghue, and former Liberal MP Nicole Flint. Well, welcome to you both. I mean, it's very clear, Nicole, there is a pro-Palestinian, I have to say almost anti-Semitic, anti-Israel bias at the ABC. You and I were both in London for ARC last week. We saw this coming out very much in the BBC, but it's patently clear with that meeting that it's at the ABC as well.
It's absolutely shocking, Peter. I mean, we all know, I know in particular, you know, how biased the ABC is. We've been talking and writing about it for years, but this really is a very disturbing sort of next level, if you like. The words that you have just used are completely appropriate to describe Hamas, not Israel. They're appropriate to describe a terrorist organisation. So how dare the ABC staff use those words in relation to Israel? Now, I'd like to say that I'm surprised by this, but I'm not. When you look at the statistics relating to ABC staff, 50% of staff in the ABC live in New South Wales. New South Wales does not contain 50% of the Australian population, and we know that most of the ABC staff live in metropolitan areas because Australia-wide, 89% of ABC staff live in a metropolitan area. The ABC is even having to move some of their Sydney-based journalists to Parramatta to try to address the perceived conflict that they only represent inner city, green-leaning individuals and electorates. Peter, this is absolutely unacceptable, and the Minister for Communications, Michelle Rowland, needs to take action to condemn these statements and do something about it.
And in Melbourne, John O'Dunningham, you've got posters at Melbourne University that have got the pictures of people that have been stolen off the streets of Israel and are now, I think, living hell on earth as the prisoners of Hamas in Gaza. And across those posters, there's now stickers put Zionist propaganda.
It's sickening to think that people in 2023 in our society would go about putting that sort of information about. I mean, the reality is that we are seeing an incredible amount of bias, sadly, in some of the coverage, as you've already said. But we've got laws in this country that should prevent this sort of activity from occurring. I mean, in every state and territory, there's an anti-discrimination commissioner, there are law enforcement agencies, and if you intimidate, humiliate, offend, bully someone based on any other characteristics, say a sexual orientation or identity or similar characteristic, they'd come down on you like a ton of bricks. But here we are seeing people get away with this right across the country, and I think it is time for a crackdown on this stuff. We shouldn't tolerate it. It's 2023 and we're a democratic, pluralistic country.
Nicole, I played at the top of the show a whole lot of stuff about hate preachers, predominantly in Western Sydney, but of course they're in other mosques and other Islamic centres around the country. The top Palestinian spokesman in Australia, he has advocated for the destruction of Israel. He's claimed that all the world's power structures focus on Zionism. He says if Israel falls over, we destroy Western imperialist control of the world. It ushers in the liberation of the earth. Now, this is the same bloke who not so long ago met with the Foreign Minister Penny Wong and Labor MP Jed Carney this month.
I just find this extraordinary as well, Peter, and Minister Penny Wong, who is one of the government's most senior ministers, needs to explain why she had this meeting, and she needs to vehemently, absolutely and utterly distance herself from and reject these statements that this gentleman has made, and again restate her support for Israel and people like Peter, the over 100 survivors of the Holocaust who live here in Australia, who are on the front page of The Australian today saying, we need your support. And the way that the world is going and the nation is going at the moment, they are terrified that we are going to see a repeat of the Holocaust because it began with this sort of behaviour, with these sorts of statements, and it needs to be stopped now.
Jono, two things that have collided in the last couple of days for me. This new data out today that says the mining and resource companies have paid more money to the tax office than every other single sector of the economy combined. This is the sector they want to close down, but of course this is money in our budget. It pays for the NDIS and our hospitals and everything else. But also this push by Westpac, following the government's announcement that they're really going to target farmers, this push by Westpac to basically have a net zero policy in relation to money they'll lend those in the agricultural sector, and the government's push to say to farmers, you've got to do more, you've got to lift your weight, we're really going to target you now on climate emissions.
Yeah, this is the madness that we are seeing in the corporate sector. I mean, on the tax first, this is something that I'm glad you've raised. You know, the Labor government are spruiking this first surplus in 20 years. No reference to the resources sector that gave them the revenue to be able to claim this surplus, and no reference to the fact that out of the taxes they collect from the mining and resources sector, they're handing millions of dollars to organisations like the Environmental Defenders Office, who are holding up new resources and mining projects through the courts, through green lawfare. And when it comes to companies like Westpac, banks like Westpac, who are saying, well, we're going to have to make things a little bit tougher in terms of our emissions and environmental obligations, well, the net result of all of this is we're going to do less business here. We're going to send it offshore to countries where they don't care about our environment, where they just want to make a buck. They don't have the same rules and protections, and it will be a net negative for the environment, let alone the economy. It's bad news all round.
Nicole Flint, I know you're a farmer. We'll get into that with you next week. John O'Dunningham, thank you both for your time. All right, coming up, our public service, more and more politicised. A new report out today. Pretty extraordinary stuff. See you soon. Welcome back. Well, for some time, I've had concerns about the politicisation of our public service, particularly at a state level, like here in Victoria, but almost every other bureaucracy too. Well, a new report today from the Centre for Independent Studies titled Politicisation, the attack on merit and our way of life, hones in on this issue. And joining me is its author, Dr. Scott Prasser. Dr. Prasser, thank you for your time. Take us through the key findings of your report.
Well, the key findings are that we've moved from the Westminster system, where public servants used to be appointed permanently. They were appointed on merit. They got promoted, wasn't controlled by politicians, and they were there whether government changed or not. And therefore, they were willing to tell the minister and the government sometimes, no, minister, that's a really dumb idea. And these days, what's really happened is more and more public servants, senior public servants, I'm not talking about ministerial staff, are appointed because they're partisan, they are party followers, or they are sympathisers with the government of the day. And also, we've moved away from having a permanent public service to one that is appointed on contract. Now, if you're on contract, you want to keep your contract renewed, you're going to say what the government wants to hear rather than what it needs to hear. That's what's been going on. And it's been going on for 3 decades, and it's become worse and worse. So we've really moved right away from any concept of an independent, neutral public service.
What about the point I made about, I think the states are perhaps the worst evidence of this that I've seen, but you've done the report. Do you think it's just as bad in Canberra as it is amongst the states?
I think it's less in Canberra, and the reason is, I think, because there's much more media coverage of the Commonwealth government, federal government, than there is at the state level. So at the Commonwealth level, also we've got a House of Representatives and a Senate estimates committee process. There's much more scrutiny. There's much more politics being under supervision. It is happening slowly, and you can see it happening under the Albanese government. On any change of government, there's always a change now of senior public servants. So both sides are sort of doing it. So, but at the state level, it's much, much more profound, and the consequences are there for us all to see.
The Victorian Ombudsman, just on the case of Victoria, she has done a whole report into politicisation, particularly under Daniel Andrews, of the Victorian bureaucracy. You say, look, there's no silver bullets here, but more transparency. You make the point about the media. You say that's key to turning this around.
Yes, I think, look, in America, they've got the Senate confirmation process where the president wants to nominate people to the Supreme Court or senior roles. They've got to go through a confirmation process. The Senate answer questions. And what that does, it makes the government very careful about who they appoint. I think, and that Ombudsman report in Victoria was because the upper house there passed a motion that there should be a review of what's been going on in Victoria. So that report's really going to be really important. So what we've got to do is make it very transparent why people are being appointed, very, very transparent about what their qualifications are, and make the government accountable of why are you appointing this person to this position. And that way it might restrain government. I think to go back to the old system, the permanent system of the Public Service Board, which is what I'd like, I think that's going to be very, very hard to do, because the temptation for governments when they get into office is we've got to replace everybody. And so one government's been in and they come in, they want to set a new set of people in. So let's make transparent. We might at least get a bit more merit about who gets appointed to all these important positions.
Yeah, I do think it's extraordinary. I mean, I've looked carefully at what happens in the United States. You know, the whole administration, 4,000 or 5,000 people go out every time a president changes and a whole new group come in. In the UK, it's more like we used to have, very small political staff, a big civil service that's there permanently. And I think we're sort of caught now between the middle. Scott Prasser, thank you for your report. Thank you for your time. I think this is incredibly important to the operation of our democracy. Dr. Scott Prasser there, thank you very much. All right, that's it for me. Andrew Bolt's up next. I'll see you Monday at 6.